In the minds of most, Cold War discourse is dominated by the struggle between the two superpowers and defined by such things as nuclear proliferation, espionage, and the space race. A titanic global confrontation that affected everyone and forced nations to choose sides between East and West, either militarily, economically, or at least ideologically. Except that isn't true. From the broad process of decolonization that had begun in the 1940s and accelerated through the 1950s and 1960s, dozens of new sovereign nations emerged on the world scene, many opposed to the bipolar world system the Cold War tried to impose. What came from this was the emergence of a third bloc of nations who didn't want to side with either the Americans or the Soviets. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to look at the creation of the Non-Aligned Movement and the 1955 Bandung Conference. This is the Cold War. If traveling is your hobby and you like to make fun videos, the sponsor of today's video, Filmorigo, is a great app to have on your phone. Filmorigo is an easy-to-use application available on Android and iPhone, allowing you to create full-featured videos, and millions are using the app to make videos easily for YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, and other platforms, or simply for personal use. This free video editor and free movie maker has over 1,000 music tracks. It can use your memory to add music and allows you to add your own voiceover to create game videos, vlogs, and much more. Filmorigo has more than 5,000 premium transitions, stickers, templates, while its intuitive trim and cut, merge and join, slice and split features make the editing a breeze. You can control speed, color correct, add animations, and export videos in HD quality quickly with Filmorigo. The app is also capable of uploading your videos, which means that your videos can be shared effortlessly. Members of the Cold War channel have been using Filmorigo to edit their videos on their phones, and you can do the same by downloading this awesome app from the link in the description. Consider leaving a review for the app if you like it. Okay, so we're going to start, like we have so often, with the end of the Second World War. The alliance that the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had forged to fight the fascists quickly began to show itself an alliance of convenience as the cordial relations they had enjoyed began to evaporate. Spheres of influence and control quickly began to form and eventually formalize. The Sovietization of East and Central Europe resulted in the creation of the Warsaw Pact, and Soviet support was freely given to socialist and leftist forces in other parts of the world, many of whom were beginning the struggle to gain independence from imperial control, whether it was British, French, Dutch, Belgian, or Portuguese. The United States, meanwhile, gathered its European allies into NATO and lent support to anti-leftist forces and governments around the world. We should note that the sides that the US chose to support did not necessarily mean they were liberal or democratic, just as long as they were anti-leftist. But not everybody wanted to participate in the emerging Cold War, with two prominent countries leading this movement. India in 1947 was newly independent, and with a population of 300 million people, had the ability to exert considerable influence on the world stage. As you can imagine, however, there was no intention to join into a Western alliance with their now former imperial subjugators. In Europe, Yugoslavia was establishing itself as a socialist nation, but one which refused to be under the thumb of Stalin's Soviet Union. Now, I'm mentioning these two nations as they were to become the locomotives that would drive the formation of a formalized non-aligned movement. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, spoke extensively of the role of non-aligned India, thoughts which captured the sentiments of many. As early as September 7, 1946, he said, "We propose, as far as possible, to keep away from the power politics of groups aligned against one another, which have led in the past to world wars and which may again lead to disasters on an even vaster scale." Nehru was also supportive of the role of a single global structure dedicated to the maintenance of peace in the world. I am, of course, referring to the United Nations, which, despite its shortcomings, Nehru believed to be a beneficial organization, and that the formation of blocs outside of it was a threat to world peace. He said, "The The beginning of this world structure has been laid in the United Nations organization. It is still feeble, it has many defects. Nevertheless, it is the beginning of the world structure, and India has pledged herself to the cooperation in its work. Now, if we think of that structure and our cooperation with other countries in achieving it, where does that question come of our being tied up with this group of nations or that group? Indeed, the more groups and blocks are formed, the weaker will that great structure become. Okay, so all this to say that from the outset of the Cold War, there were major countries who did not want to align themselves to either of the two blocks, but were also actively looking to assert their positions on the international stage. Now, there are several factors that help propel and fuel this movement. The first was the dramatic increase in the number of newly independent nations, largely in Asia and Africa. As decolonization sped up in the years after the Second World War, many emerging nations wanted to join the international community, but were not interested in aligning themselves to either East or West. This is understandable, as many of those new nations had expended a great deal of effort to remove their alignment to imperial powers. Instead, they sought a third way. Of course, post-colonialism doesn't explain everything. Some of the most active nations within the non-aligned movement that was to emerge, like Yugoslavia and Ethiopia, had no history of colonialism. No, 5 years of Italian occupation doesn't really count as colonialism. So what drove these nations to seek a third way? Well, economics. Many of these nations were experiencing significant economic challenges and wanted and needed trading and investment partners. The fear for many, however, was that by forming trade agreements with the East or West blocs, that it would eventually lead to political dependencies, which they were eager to avoid. So naturally, forming closer economic ties to other non-aligned nations became an attractive option. And one of the best places for these new ties to be forged was, not surprisingly, the United Nations. It provided a platform for not only the establishment of relationships, but a forum that allowed for the strengthening of cooperation between future members of the non-aligned movement. But wait, there's more. The Yugoslav School also identified two other factors that boosted the establishment of the NAM. The first related to the Western Bloc and their shared Judeo-Christian roots. Many of the newly independent former colonies were automatically outsiders to this philosophical tradition, meaning no strong tie existed to keep former colony and former colonizer linked to each other. The other factor outlined by the Yugoslav School related more to the East Bloc and socialist policies. While many nations looked to a socialist path for their future development, they did not want to give up their autonomy to Moscow. This was a two-way street as well. Moscow, especially in the Stalinist years, was not overly tolerant of dissent among its allies and satellites. As such, their membership in the Soviet bloc would have been rather problematic. So we can conclude that there was broad and growing interest from many countries to becoming involved on the international stage without becoming entangled in the Cold War framework that we often think of as being omnipresent. One of the earliest meetings demonstrating this interest was the Asian Relations Conference, held in New Delhi in March and April of 1947. This meeting was organized and led by, of course, Nehru, and was intended to bring together the leading men and women of Asia on a common platform to study the problems of common concern to the people of the continent, to focus attention on social, economic, and cultural problems of the different countries of Asia, and to foster mutual contact and understanding. The conference, historic if only for being the first major conference organized specifically for Asian nations, was attended by delegates and observers from 28 different countries. India, Indonesia, Burma, and Ceylon were heavily represented, but there were representatives from several Soviet republics as well, including Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Well, you will recall that the Soviet republics were technically allowed to conduct their own foreign policy. Their participation clearly shows the interest that the Soviet Union as a whole had in forging alliances with these new and emerging nations. A second Asian Relations Conference was held in January of 1949, largely with the purpose of discussing the worsening situation in Indonesia's fight for independence from the Netherlands. The second conference was attended by representatives of 19 countries, and a call was made in support of Indonesian independence. Along with this call came the adoption of a resolution to, quote, explore ways and means of establishing suitable machinery having regard to the areas concerned for promoting consultation and cooperation within the framework of the United Nations, end quote. Effectively, this was an agreement that these meetings should continue but be built into the United Nations as a method of creating dialogue and discussion. 5 years later, starting in April of 1954, the Prime Ministers of India, Ceylon, Burma, Pakistan, and Indonesia met in Colombo at the Colombo Powers Conference, where no specific agenda topics were prearranged, but rather served as an opportunity for the five nations to discuss the various challenges each faced, notably Kashmir. But importantly for our story today was an Indonesian proposal to organize a conference of both Asian and African countries, what was to become the 1955 Bandung Conference. The Bandung Conference, held in April of 1955 in the Indonesian city, which conveniently shared the same name, was a meeting of representatives from 29 different Asian and African countries, or soon-to-be countries, and was co-sponsored by the governments of Burma, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Ceylon. The primary aim of the conference was to discuss peace, the role of the Third World, or developing nations in the Cold War, and issues of decolonization, as well as the potential for economic and political cooperation between the participating nations. Speeches given during the conference touched on a number of global issues of concern, including the global arms race and nuclear proliferation. They also talked to methods of improved economic development, better governmental services, and agricultural production in developing nations. The Bandung Conference was a seemingly raggle-taggle group of nations with different agendas, different political systems, and with a wide range of economic and societal development. But despite this, it didn't stop them from agreeing on what has become known as the 10 Principles of Bandung. They are respect of fundamental human rights and the objectives and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, recognition of the equality among all races and of the equality among nations, both large and small, non-intervention or non-interference into the internal affairs of another country, respect of the right of every nation to defend itself, either individually or collectively, in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations, non-use of collective defense pacts to benefit the specific interests of any of the great powers, and non-use of pressures by any country against other countries, refraining from carrying out or threatening to carry out aggression or from the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any country, peaceful solution of all international conflicts in conformity with the Charter of the United Nations, promotion of mutual interests and of cooperation, respect of justice and of international obligations. You can see clearly from these principles the value the declarants placed on not only autonomy and nonviolence, but also on the use of existing international bodies, specifically the United Nations, to achieve mediated solutions to international conflicts. From the perspective of Cold War politics, these 10 principles would have looked like a shining city on a hill to any nation wishing to avoid superpower entanglements. Recent events in places like East Germany, Guatemala, Iran, and Korea would have loomed large in the minds of many. Now, the Bandung Conference is widely seen as the immediate precursor to the foundation of the non-aligned movement. But those of you who already know this story are aware that one major player in the non-aligned movement was not present at Bandung in 1955. That's Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, as we've covered in several episodes already, was a socialist nation, but had somewhat messily divorced itself from Moscow in 1948. In the wake of that breakup, it became clear that on the international stage, Tito's Yugoslavia most often sided with countries like India and Indonesia in its voting record in bodies like the United Nations. In 1956, Tito invited Nehru and the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser to his summer state residence on the Brioni Islands, where the Brioni Declaration was made, stating their opposition to the politics of the Cold War and the desire to form closer relations between countries not aligned to either of the blocs dominated by the superpowers. Keep in mind, this declaration didn't prevent the participants from engaging and trading with the blocs, especially regarding arms deals, just declared an opposition to taking formal sides. The Brioni Declaration was followed in 1960 by a meeting at the UN General Assembly between the leaders of India, Egypt, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, and newly independent Ghana, which ensured cooperation between their states in order to achieve the adoption of the Declaration on Decolonization by the UN General Assembly. So all of this finally culminated in Belgrade in September of 1961 with the first summit conference, officially called the Conference of the Heads of State or Government of Non-Aligned Countries. Sponsored by India, Indonesia, Egypt, Syria, and Yugoslavia, there were 25 participant nations: Sudan, Tunisia, the United Arab Republic, Yemen, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Algeria, Burma, Cambodia, Ceylon, Cuba, Cyprus, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, India, Indonesia, Iraq, Lebanon, Mali, Morocco, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, and Somalia. In addition, there were observer nations in attendance, including Brazil, Bolivia, and Ecuador, as well as representatives from trade unions from countries like Japan. The result of the summit was the Declaration of the Non-Aligned Movement, although it is interesting to note that the specific name, which we're now all so familiar with, wasn't actually formally used until 1976. The choice of the word movement should also be taken into consideration. It was favored over the word organization, as people involved were keen to avoid the bureaucratic implications associated with an organization. Now, all of this that I've been talking about has been the events and perspectives of those inside the NAM. But how was it all being viewed by the two nations whose power blocs had spurred the creation of the third bloc, who wanted to remain apart from both of them? Well, let's start with the United States. Initially, Washington, D.C. viewed both the Bandung Conference and the NAM with a great deal of caution. The generally left-leaning ideologies held by most participating nations was obviously somewhat at odds with America's distrust of the left and their intentions. Additionally, the United States needed to tread carefully around the topic of decolonization. While they generally supported decolonization efforts, even actively supporting some, given that two significant colonizers, Britain and France, were primary allies of the United States, they wanted to tread carefully. As for the Soviet Union, they too struggled to come to terms with the NAM. While they shared the language and rhetoric of anti-imperialism and decolonization, which one could think would bring them closer together, that the NAM was formed primarily to avoid becoming entwined in the power blocs of the superpowers automatically prevented that. Additionally, Soviet actions in places like Czechoslovakia in 1968 was to demonstrate that Moscow's words regarding anti-imperialism were hollow at best. Okay, so with the creation of this third way, what impact did this have on the conduct of the Cold War itself? Well, despite the fact that the NAM has survived to this day, certainly outliving the Soviet Union, its impact on global affairs during the Cold War was negligible. Definitely, the major Cold War issues that developed since 1961 were handled by the East-West blocs and not the NAM. While it was a forum for discussion and a meeting place for cooperation for those who wanted, as well as a platform to criticize both East and West, ultimately the non-aligned movement lacked a positive cohesion that would allow it to act as a united bloc to effect change. Member nations were united not by a common ideology or a set of policies, but rather a desire to remain uninvolved from the larger global struggle. The Russian writer Yevgeny Matanin summed this up with his remark: "Near communists resided those who enjoyed killing and torturing. Near kings and sheiks resided actual cannibals. Some of the members of the movement endured almost a physical disgust towards the other." We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have created a separate block of bell buttons that can openly criticize and critique the original bell button without actually getting involved in the pressing of that bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. And we're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support would be greatly appreciated via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.